All right, so just to remind you, we're on epithelial tissues. We're looking at types and examples of epithelial tissues, just so we're all on the same page. Okay, so we continue on here. We have stratified squamous epithelium, and I know I'm saying this quickly, but just go back and make sure you're getting it all down and that you watch it many times or read it many times, whatever you need to do to really get this stuff into your vernacular, into your language. Stratified is a term that means many layers. Squamous means squashed. Okay, so a typical place where we find stratified squamous epithelium would be the skin. There, the cells would be keratinized or containing keratin. This one is stratified squamous epithelium lining the esophagus. And so here we're showing the esophagus is the part of the anatomy that allows you to swallow your food and bring it down into the stomach. Okay, so this would be a place you'd find stratified squamous epithelium in places where a lot of damage might take place, and it's mostly there for protection, for protecting the underlying tissues. So it's lining areas where there might be a lot of damage. So, for example, the surface of your skin. No, we don't have a picture of that, but here we go. Here's our apical surface. You see the space above. Here's our basal surface. You see the connective tissue below. This looks kind of different. You know, at the basal layer here, you can see that the cells look rather cuboidal. You can see the defined nuclei. See all these pink guys in there? Those are all nuclei that are actually quite defined. These are cells that are undergoing mitosis. These are cells that are regenerating all the time and constantly pushing their way up. And guess why? Because at this apical surface, the cells are constantly sloughing off. And in fact, at the apical surface, these cells by this time are dead. By the time they've pushed their way up through these layers, the cells at the apical surface will have died off. And you can see that the cells begin to flatten as they get higher up. So they look rather cuboidal at the basal layers, and they look rather squamous at the apical layer. Oh, what do you do? Okay. This is a very special type of tissue. It's different from anything else, and it looks different from anything else. I really like this picture here. Transitional epithelium. It's an epithelial tissue. It has all the characteristics. It has those cellularity. It has specialized contacts. It is regenerative. It has an apical surface. You see the space up above. It has a basal surface. You see the connective tissue down below. But it looks different. I mean, I think sometimes students mistake this for for stratified squamous epithelium, but it's just not. It's just different. So this is stratified squamous epithelium. Remember that the apical layer has flattened cells, but you can see that that does not hold true for transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium is very special. You do have many layers, so it looks to be stratified, and that is true, but it's just different. You can see that at the basal layer, these are cells that are undergoing mitosis, and they will grow upward. You start to get cells at the apical surface that have kind of this rounded look to them, but they are certainly not squamous. The beauty of this tissue is that it stretches. It stretches. And no other tissue in your body actually stretches like this. There are tissues in your body that are flexible or that are able to have many different qualities, but this is pretty much the only tissue of your body that actually stretches. And it's only present in 3 places. The bladder is especially famous, but also the ureters leading to the bladder and the urethra leading from the bladder. You have to have stretchability in these tissues. So there are specialized muscles, and we'll talk about those muscles, for example, in the bladder that have all kinds of different functions. But in order to have a bladder that gets very small when it's empty or very large when it's full, you need that epithelial tissue lining the bladder to be very, very flexible and stretchable. So it's one of the most special tissues of our body. It simply grows nowhere else in our body. So just keep in mind, this is the epithelial layer of the bladder, the ureters and the urethra. Keep in mind that there are also muscles here too. We're quite far from actually discussing those muscles, but this is simply the lining of the bladder. The muscles are special too, and they would be underlying all of this connective tissue. The last type of epithelial tissue we'll discuss is special. It's glandular epithelium. A gland is a group of cells which make and secrete a particular product. A duct is a tube-like connection to epithelial sheets. And so there are different types of ducts and different types of glands, and you can kind of look over these pictures here. In my class, I don't cover these in great detail, but you do have to understand that whenever you're thinking about a gland, whether it is an exocrine gland or whether it is an endocrine gland, it will always be made of epithelial tissues. So exocrine glands are what we're looking at here. They secrete substances to the outside. They have a duct. So down here, we have the red material that is secreting a particular substance, say, for example, sebum or sweat. And then we have a duct that actually leads up to the surface. If you look carefully, you'll be able to see the cells lining this entire thing. It's not always easy for students to remember that glands and ducts are made entirely of epithelial cells. But you can see that cellularity and specialized contacts completely lining the thing. More examples of exocrine glands. And then remember, when we talk about endocrine glands down the line, the idea of endo, meaning inner, meaning that it secretes something into the body. Those are also made of very special epithelial tissues. Here are more types of exocrine glands. Merocrine glands here, holocrine glands here. Merocrine glands are able to secrete substances and still remain intact. Holocrine glands tend to rupture as they secrete their substances. Lastly, we're going to come to nervous tissue, and that seems like a weird place to go from epithelial tissues, but it turns out that epithelial tissues and nervous tissues have a lot in common with each other. Epithelial tissues, remember that the key word is lining, lining or protection or surface covering, whereas nervous tissue, the key word is control and communication. It sure sounds very different, but they actually have a very similar makeup, a similar developmental process. They derive from similar materials, similar embryonic materials. So it's actually appropriate to talk about them now. Now, just to remind you, major type of tissues: epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle. So here we're landing on our nervous tissue. And our nervous tissue, again, control and communication. We're going to be talking a lot about nervous tissue down the line, so I'm basically just introducing it to you right now so that you can know some general things about it. Okay, so we can recognize nervous tissue very readily because there are these pretty substantial cell bodies, and then there are these little thread-like things coming out of them, and you can see all kinds of dots in between. And there's three parts to a neuron that you should know. There's the cell body, which is that central part, very easy to pick out in this picture. You can see the cell bodies. Your nuclei and your organelles are going to be found in there. You can actually see the nuclei in all these guys. See that little kind of lighter orange color to it. And then all these strings coming from there will either be bringing a signal into the neuron or sending the signal on from the neuron. So these structures are called dendrites and axons. Dendrites are threads that bring the signal into the cell body. Axons are structures that send the signal out from the cell body. And it would be very difficult actually to pick out the axons and dendrites in an actual picture. They're not quite what you think they are. Sometimes a very long stringy thing, you're thinking that must be the axon because it's supposed to be thicker and so on. But in fact, that may be a dendrite. It may actually be bringing information in. You just don't really know. Unless you specialize in that particular type of neuron and you've studied it, you wouldn't necessarily know which is which. Very difficult to pick out. So the location here: brain, spinal cord, nerves. And we'll be talking lots more about these guys down the line.